Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Townsend. I'm an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security, and it's great to see you all, and so glad you're able to participate and attend this rollout of a paper that Andrea Kendall Taylor and myself and some of our panelists have been working on concerning Russia in the Arctic. This is an issue that when we began this work was really something that we felt was a growing concern among the Arctic nations and others in terms of what was happening with Russia up in their part of the Arctic, up in the European Arctic. It impacted the U.S. Arctic and Alaska, and impacted NATO and the Arctic that NATO has to be prepared to defend because of Norway. So it had its own reasons a year ago, but with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, that impact now has skyrocketed in terms of what will Russia then depend on in terms of the Arctic. Not just more resources because of sanctions and other things that are going to cause Russia to look north, but also because with Sweden and Finland hopefully joining NATO very shortly, there's a whole new geopolitical and military picture up there in the north for Putin to be concerned about. The Northern Fleet area is up there in the north. Norway is now joined by two new allies, who one of whom shares a long border with Russia. So the strategic situation in Europe, in the European Arctic, has changed now for Russia, and it's changed for NATO too. So Andrea and I traveled through the area. We talked to very good colleagues up there, and we put together a report called Russia in the Arctic. And you can get this report if you log into CNAS. It's available coming out of the wonderful CNAS Tech Center, where you can find all kinds of CNAS publications, and particularly this one. I hope you're able to access it, and we would love to hear from you, your comments after reading it, and suggestions perhaps for a follow-on look as the situation in Europe continues to unfold. We're very lucky today because we have a show that's going to start off with what we call a fireside chat with two very good friends and colleagues of mine who are going to join me to talk about the report. And they both come from the U.S. government. And you will see them appear on the screen shortly, and I'll give them an introduction, and we'll begin our discussion. Following those two, we will have a panel of experts on the Arctic who will also give their views after taking a look at the report and participating in the report with us, and also what they've heard from the fireside chat. And then we'll be finished up at 11:30. So it's great that you're here. And what I want to do now is to bring on Doug Jones, who is a great friend and colleague, longstanding from the State Department. And then Greg Pollock, who is also a great friend from the Department of Defense, the Office of Secretary of Defense. So Doug is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. He handles a pretty broad portfolio, not just NATO, but also OSCE and the Baltics. He's got both multinational organizations as well as the bilateral relations with countries in Europe. And so Das Jones is very busy. I knew Doug when he was the Deputy Chief of Mission at NATO, and he did a wonderful job there, and he's doing that same thing at Maine State. Greg Pollock, I knew also when I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Pentagon a few years ago. He's the Principal Director for Arctic and Global Resilience in OSD, and that's a new office. He's the acting DASD now there. His DASD, I think, is on maternity leave, and so we're going to get started and have some views from these two government officials whose responsibility is the Arctic. And what I want to do first, actually, Greg, if we could, your office is a new one there in OSD, and I was wondering, could you give us just a little rundown on your office and what it's responsible for and what it's working on and how things are going? I'm sure you're still painting the walls and putting in the drapes, but tell us how it's going.
Sure thing, Jim. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today. It's a pleasure to be here with you virtually and with the audience, as well as speaking alongside Deputy Assistant Secretary Jones, who, as you said, has been a great colleague to us now and has been for a very long time. So it's great to be reconnected with you, Jim. As you said, our new office, the Office of Arctic and Global Resilience Policy, it's one of the first new offices to be created from whole cloth within the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy in a very long time. And I think it speaks to the centrality of the issues that we're going to discuss today. I think there's recognition within the Office of the Secretary of Defense that the Arctic is becoming a more strategically relevant region. And likewise, that the issues around climate change and the need for resilience across the Joint Force and beyond, these issues are becoming front and center for the department. So ensuring the department is prepared for the evolving security environment in the Arctic and elsewhere, whether it's with respect to implications from the conflict in Ukraine with respect to the Arctic, or implications of climate change in various theaters. These are issues that I think we recognize are national security issues. Maybe historically they've been treated as more like development challenges or issues that were handled elsewhere in government. But Secretary Austin's been very clear, and the National Defense Strategy that was passed to Congress in March is quite clear that climate change is a central challenge of our time. And so our office has stood up to kind of get our heads around what that means for the Department of Defense and ensure that we're participating in interagency conversations around all these issues. Obviously, energy security is another part of our mandate, and that's an issue that's front and center, and I think quite topical to what we're here to discuss today. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what we're focusing on. It is a broad writ, and these challenges are immense and global in nature. And as you say, we are still sort of fully staffing out the team, but I think we're making good progress, and I appreciate the chance to give you an update on our progress here this morning.
Well, Greg, thank you very much. When I was the DASD, I had in our office the responsibility for the Arctic as well. And I always felt that we needed to have a central point within OSD to handle Arctic affairs. We didn't have enough time to handle Arctic as well as all the other European responsibilities that we had. So I was very happy when I heard that this office had been developed, and I'm expecting great things, and I'll be watching. And I'm sure you all will do that. But let me turn to Doug. It's interesting. There's some balancing, I think, that has to be done when you look at the Arctic. Greg was talking about this a bit. We see this now as a major national security concern. It's something the Pentagon and the Secretary of Defense is really focusing on, and so the Arctic is taking on this security focus in a lot of ways, a cast that it's, in Alaska, we're hearing about the Army doing a lot of things there. And we know, of course, in Europe, NATO and NATO allies doing things too. But I will tell you from my experience, and I think this is where you probably are having to deal with it too, Arctic is more than defense. There's a lot of things happening in the Arctic, in the scientific community and other places that have been impacted by the war in Ukraine, impacted by our relations with Russia, and so when you're looking at the Arctic, we got to have a balance between defense on the one hand and all the other issues that the State Department has to handle as well. But there's another balance too, and that's Alaska on the one hand, which is so important to the United States. That's the U.S. Arctic. But on the other hand, because we're in NATO, we have to pay attention to the European Arctic as well. I think you're probably the balancer in chief when it comes to the U.S. policy towards the Arctic. Do you want to talk about that? What, as the State Department looks at the Arctic, you've got pretty broad responsibilities.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to see you again, and great to be on here with Greg. Thank you for pulling this together and for your report. I think you make a great point when we talk about the Arctic. The United States has so many interests here that a lot of focus is given to the security questions, but there's a lot happening here, and it's the reason why we have, on this panel, state and DOD, but across the U.S. government, I've never seen more agencies involved in any issue than on the Arctic, because we have climate change, we have economic development that we're working with, that's at stake here, safety, in addition to security, the interests of our local and indigenous populations in the Arctic. These are all at play here, and this is not something that can be done just by state or DoD, but really a whole of government effort. So we've invested quite a lot in increasing our whole of government approach to this. We have an executive steering board where we coordinate within the U.S. government, but we need a comprehensive approach in the way that we're dealing with this. The situation in the Arctic is changing. It is of rising importance, both through climate change, where warming is happening in the Arctic at a rate 4 times the global average, where we see rising geopolitical competition there. These impact security, but they're impacting all these other interests as well. And so I think it just underlines the imperative that we have a comprehensive strategy and that we do it increasingly with allies and partners.
Well, thank you. And let's look at that idea of a comprehensive strategy. You know, there's been a lot of questions about having a U.S. Arctic strategy. And I know that there's a lot of strategy documents that the administration is still working on. But the Arctic strategy, I'm sure, is an interagency worked document. But I think the pen probably belongs to state. I'm guessing. You can tell me if I'm wrong, or the NSC staff, perhaps. But tell us about the Arctic strategy, kind of where it is. Is it being worked on? Who's got the pen on this? Where it might be going? And then I'm going to, just to give Greg a heads up, I want to ask you about the DoD strategy document. There was one written in the last administration, which wasn't bad as those go. I think I had to work on the one before that, which didn't probably give enough attention to the Arctic, but there was one that followed on that I think is pretty good. And so starting there with Doug, where's the Arctic strategy? And then Greg, tell me about where the DoD strategy might fit in. So Doug.
Jim, I think the first main point is, we have an Arctic strategy. The U.S. has actually been quite consistent over the years in advancing a vision for the Arctic and a strategy to get us there. We do have a vision for the Arctic as a place of low tension, where states act responsibly, where we can have economic development and investment in a sustainable and transparent way that respects the environment, the interests of our local and indigenous communities. And this is what we've been working towards in this comprehensive way that I talked about earlier, given the whole range of interests that it intersects. The most recent formal strategy that the U.S. government produced was in 2013. That still stands. But as we've discussed, a lot has changed since then, with climate change happening at a much more rapid pace and impacting the Arctic disproportionately, with rising geopolitical competition with Russia and China. And so we're working on updating the national strategy for the Arctic, and hopefully that will be released soon. And I think you're going to see in there a lot of these changes reflected.
And I guess they will be reflected in the national security strategy. I know that's supposed to come out soon as well.
Correct. And I think, I can't say much about it, but to say, the rising importance of the Arctic in our own national security and our national strategy, we can expect will be reflected in the national security strategy.
Is it in the NSC that's putting together the updates to the 2013, or is that state?
So it's a large, like everything Arctic, it's a huge interagency process. We all have input into it. It's being led by the NSC.
It is. Great. So it's good to know that there's an NSC point of contact as well, who's going to be honchoing the whole effort. That does show quite an important administration interest in the Arctic. So that's good to know. Well, Greg, going now to DoD, as I mentioned, the strategy that was put out a few years ago by the previous administration wasn't bad. As strategies go, you had to get a machete to cut through all the initiatives and ideas and the boilerplate that was in there. But at the end of the day, it wasn't bad, I felt. And I looked like the military services created their own independent strategies based on that. Air Force, Navy, Army develop strategies. And it sounds like to me, I mean, from what I can tell on the outside, that the Army is really taking it to heart, has been doing a lot of things, new military formations in Alaska, this kind of thing. I haven't seen a lot of Army work in terms of the European part of the Arctic. You know, that's been more of a NATO thing. It's been the Marines and the Navy have been involved up there. Air Force, I think, in some ways too. But is there work now being considered to update that? You probably need to wait on the update to the 2013 Arctic strategy the administration's working on. But are you all thinking about making some changes to the defense one? And how about the services? How are they doing in implementing the last one?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. As Doug mentioned, you know, there's an interagency effort that's advanced, I think, fairly significantly in terms of rethinking the U.S. government-wide approach to the Arctic and what changes to the strategic environment mean for U.S. policy in the Arctic. As you said, there is a 2019 DoD Arctic strategy, and as you alluded, that strategy was put together in advance of the existence of my current office, an office that was dedicated to the Arctic. So it was written by our strategy office and obviously your old office, Europe, NATO, and my old office, the Russia shop, you know, had important contributions to that. And I think it turned out pretty well. And reviewing it in advance of our conversation this morning, in my view, particularly the ends and the ways remain quite applicable. It's the 2019 strategy underscores the importance of the Arctic in terms of protecting the U.S. homeland and makes clear that DoD's objective is to maintain peace and stability in the Arctic, working closely alongside allies and partners. And I think any follow-on strategy will have similar points of emphasis in terms of the ends as well as the ways. To your point about the military department's implementation strategies, perhaps that's an area where we still have some work to do, is thinking through the means and ensuring that the military departments, the services are developing the necessary capabilities. I do think, you know, as a administration-wide strategy is promulgated, the department will do some analysis and some hard thinking about ways in which we need to account for changes in the security environment, whether it's the increased urgency of the climate challenge or the implications of the conflict in Ukraine for stability and security in the Arctic. And we'll make some judgments as to whether we need to rewrite the strategy or simply make some updates around the margins. I will say that that strategy was quite prescient in noting, quote, the Arctic remains vulnerable to strategic spillover from tensions, competition, or conflict arising in other regions, end quote. And I think we're seeing that today. The fact that our conversation is themed around Russia in the Arctic does suggest that there have been some changes since 2019 that we're going to have to account for, and we're going to work closely with EUCOM and with NORTHCOM in particular to ensure that we are clear on what our operational and strategic requirements are in the Arctic, that they're baked in the strategy, and then we are following through the programming, planning, and budgeting and execution cycle to make sure that we have the resources we need so the Joint Force can operate in the Arctic and can respond to contingencies there as necessary.
Oh, thank you. No, that sounds great. And I've got two more questions that I'm going to ask, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience at 11:30. So send in your hardest questions for these guys. You got them on the hook now, and now's your chance to ask them some of the real zingers. Sorry, guys, I don't want to set you up, but I do want questions. But let me ask two quick questions. The first one is you mentioned Greg, working with allies, and that was certainly something that all of us certainly agreed to, et cetera. And Doug, you having been at NATO as the DCM there, and you and I have worked NATO for a long time. Let me ask you to start off with, when we talk about allies, so where is the NATO Arctic strategy? I say that with a laugh, and I really shouldn't. I'm sure NATO knows they've got to deal with it. Madrid, it seemed to me the Madrid NATO summit and the strategic concept, I didn't see a lot of Arctic in there. But when you bring in Sweden and Finland into NATO, you're going to have a big Arctic, bloc, the Nordic bloc in the alliance, and also great responsibilities on NATO to be able to fight and win in the Arctic if there are some problems in that part of the world for NATO. So what have you heard in terms of NATO planning on an Arctic strategy, or where they might be, and how much coordination there is between NATO and the allies, including us? And then the second question is going to be about China, and we'll go quickly on that because I want to get to the audience. But Doug, and also Greg, pipe in about where NATO is. Where are our allies? Starting with Doug.
So Jim, on the question of a NATO Arctic strategy, I mean, NATO doesn't have a standalone Arctic strategy. NATO's approach has been to sort of infuse the High North, is the term in art in NATO,
Right.
within all of its different work strands, rather than a standalone strategy. We did see, as you mentioned, Arctic was mentioned in the strategic concept. That's new. It talked about recognizing how Russia's ability from the Arctic to threaten sea lanes of communication and reinforcement is a strategic challenge for the alliance. The allies also talked about the High North in the declaration from the Brussels summit, and it talked there about how allies will do more, continue and increase activities in the Arctic, and continue to work with partners, which I think was a reference to Finland and Sweden, which were then partners and are now soon to be allies. So, the alliance is paying more and more attention to the Arctic due to Russia's increased presence there, China's search for influence there. It will pay more attention when Finland and Sweden join, and we will have 7 of the 8 Arctic nations within the alliance. So there's going to be a lot more Arctic at NATO. Allies are investing more in capabilities that give NATO the ability to increase its presence in the Arctic. And we've seen NATO increase its presence in the Arctic. 2 of the largest exercises that NATO held in recent years, Trident Juncture and can't remember the name offhand of the second one, were both held in the High North. That's an indication of NATO playing a bigger role there. So whether or not NATO does agree to do a standalone strategy, I think the increased focus of the alliance, NATO's increased presence and activity in the alliance will continue.
Oh, well, Doug, I'm going to ask you an unfair question, and that is, do you foresee some command structure changes as a result of the Arctic, or do you think NATO's happy with the way things are now? And with bringing in Sweden and Finland, I mean, any rumors? You want to give us any scoops?
So I don't have much tantalizing to say on that. It's an issue of discussion whether it makes sense to create a command to handle the High North, given Sweden and Finland's joining the alliance. On the other hand, NATO has a pretty comprehensive command structure that's flexible. So I can't predict if there'll be changes, other than it's a good issue for discussion. Gives us something to work on going forward.
Well, I'm ready to take control of the command module that'll be up in Norway or wherever in the Nordics. I'm ready to go. Just let me know when the decision's been made. So, Greg, anything from you on the NATO angle, and then let's talk about China. In fact, Joseph from the audience has already asked about China, and so this is going to cover a question from the audience as well. So, Greg, over to you. Any NATO, and then let's talk about China.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And I concur with everything that Doug has articulated. I just want to note, though, so we all bear in mind that the Arctic remains peaceful, and we want to do everything we can to keep it that way. I think there's obviously growing concern about security and stability in the Arctic, but the Arctic has long been preserved as this sort of area of stability and peaceful dialogue, because in large degree the work of the State Department through the Arctic Council. So we want to do everything we can to keep it that way. But that said, the Arctic like-minded nation, so the 7 Arctic nations less Russia, I can't really think of any other grouping in the world that brings so many common interests and so much capability to bear. So it's a great pleasure to work with these allies and partners. And I think we do expect that, particularly with the accession of Sweden and Finland, that there will be more Arctic in NATO, simply by virtue of their joining the alliance. That said, they've, of course, as you know well, Jim, they've been working very closely with NATO for a long time. But we're going to work very closely with all of the Arctic nations to ensure that we are developing the right capabilities, that we're continuing to foster interoperability, including through the large-scale exercises that Doug mentioned. We know that the Arctic plays very importantly in both Russia and China's medium to long-term strategic plans, and we need to ensure that NATO and the Arctic 7 are prepared for a range of outcomes. I think the fact that your report that we're here to discuss today thinks in terms of scenarios, I think that's incredibly constructive and will certainly inform the dialogue that we have with the other Arctic nations as we think about the capabilities that we need to ensure that NATO interests are protected 360 degrees.
Well, thank you for that. And let's turn quickly to China. Joseph had asked the question about how is the administration thinking about China's role in the Arctic? That was in our report as well. We think that the role of China is only going to increase as they take advantage of the opportunities presented by Russia's need for help now, and helping them to tap into resources that will need special technology and that type of thing that Russia may no longer have access to. And also that Russia will need to have the revenue coming from the Arctic as well, and plus the military side, where I think the Russians are going to feel that their Northern Fleet area, the most sensitive military site that they have, they're going to feel under pressure from NATO up there. So China's got an opportunity to become even more involved in the Northern Sea route and working with Russia. What do you all see up there in terms of China's role in the Arctic? Greg, why don't we start? Let's start with you, and then we'll move to Doug.
Sure thing. So, needless to say, China is the pacing threat for the U.S. Department of Defense. The National Defense Strategy is very clear about that, as was in large degree the 2018 National Defense Strategy. So we're watching both Russian and Chinese activities and intentions in the Arctic very closely. As you noted, Jim, Russia is becoming increasingly reliant on China. Their decisions to cut off gas flows to Europe in particular has made them economically more and more dependent on China. The fact that China and Russia pronounced this no limits partnership right on the eve of Russia's further invasion and escalation of the conflict in Ukraine, I think it's a delicate moment for that relationship. But we do see, I think the Chinese driving a hard bargain with Russia, and we'll see to what degree Russia is comfortable being the junior partner in that relationship over time. But one of the few things that Russia can offer China is the fact that they do have the greatest percentage of Arctic territory, and China is very interested in the Arctic for its natural resources over time, and potentially as a transit route to solve strategic problems around imports and exports, through the Malacca Straits and other commercial sea lanes. So, we're looking very closely at what China is up to. Obviously, we see them potentially using the guise of scientific inquiry in the Arctic to pursue activities that could have other uses. Russia obviously is continuing to double and triple down on its prioritization of the Arctic, looking at the Arctic as an engine of Russia's economy more and more. Even in advance of the conflict, the Arctic accounted for some 20 to 25% of Russian GDP. And it's clearly their hope that the liquid natural gas facilities that they're building up there will be able to see them through the challenges they're having with respect to sanctions. We are seeing those sanctions taking a bite, though, in terms of their ability to continue developing the Russian Arctic and developing these LNG plants The fact that there isn't a single international transit projected through the Northern Sea Route in 2022. This is down from something like 86 international transits from some 24 nations in 2021. I think this is telling that Russia's plans, have some real challenges before them. But as you say, it's your report highlights the risks associated with the growing Russian and Chinese partnership, both broadly and specifically with respect to the Arctic, and that's something the Department of Defense watches very closely.
Yeah, well, thank you. No, you're right. Our findings track very closely to what you were just saying as well. We'll see how it looks next year as things continue to evolve. But Doug, how about its state in terms of China? And also you might want to say something about the Arctic Council. With Sweden and Finland joining, then you've got all NATO nations except for Russia. And China has been a wannabe in some ways. They're seen as this informal, observer in the Arctic Council. But throw in a little bit about how you're looking on the Arctic Council as well. So China, and then a little bit on the Arctic Council.
Sure. I mean, I think our perspective is, very similar for what we hear Greg articulate. And I think, your report is right to focus on the Russia-China dynamic. Certainly with what's happening in Ukraine, we think, Russia is feeling likely to feel more vulnerable, particularly including in the high north, given the strong unified response from NATO allies and also their own poor performance in Ukraine, but also with respect to China, given their energy dependence, they're becoming more dependent on China, and we need to watch how that might play out in the Arctic. There's a risk there. Traditionally, Russia has been reluctant to give China any openings into the Arctic. It doesn't want it playing there either, but perhaps it will feel compelled to, and we need to watch that. As we watch China throughout the Arctic, I mean, the things that particularly concern us are efforts by China to use some of these coercive economic policies or lending, purchasing of critical national infrastructure to gain control of them, that are deeply worrying to us, and I think to increasingly to the other members of the other Arctic nations. And also the scientific research that China is pursuing, which has civilian but also military uses. And we're focused on that, and also building our own resilience and the resilience of like-minded Arctic nations against these kinds of practices in the Arctic and more generally. On the Arctic Council, I can say, we remain committed to the Arctic Council as the governing body for the Arctic, because of its aggression in Ukraine. Business as usual with Russia is off the table, and that's why we suspended our participation in the Arctic Council. All 7 non-Russian Arctic Council members did that. We have restarted cooperation among the 7 on those projects of the Arctic Council that do not include Russia. So work continues in the Arctic Council. We think it still remains the future, and we'll look to the day when Russia can change its behavior before we can get back to the full work on the Council.
Yeah, that might be a long time from now when we see Russia in such a place where they can join the Arctic Council, but that's just my view. Let me go to the audience now. Alex has a very good question that I'm going to read to you, and if I can find it here, there it is. So Alex has asked that if the Kremlin continues to face battlefield setbacks in Ukraine, do you sense it will retreat from the Arctic or become more assertive in the short and long term? Our report talked quite a bit about that, and you all have alluded to bits of it. What would you say?
I'll go ahead and jump in here. You were breaking up just very briefly there, Jim. But I think it's pretty clear that President Putin is going to continue emphasizing the Arctic and the Arctic's role in both Russia's economic and sort of wider strategy. He said in April, not too long after escalating the conflict in Ukraine, he said, quote, "I want to underline that considering the various external limitations and pressure from sanctions, we now must devote special attention to all the projects and plans connected with the Arctic. There can be no delays, no postponement," end quotation. I think this is one of these situations where, when someone tells you who they are, we need to believe them. And I think we're going to continue to see Russia looking to the Arctic as a place where they can generate revenues. That said, they are, operationally challenged, and they're redeploying forces and capabilities from other parts of Russia to, bolster what they're doing in Ukraine. And they're going to be challenged, as I alluded to earlier, in terms of gaining access to the sorts of technologies and the financing they need to make Putin's vision of the Arctic as this kind of economic engine for Russia achievable. As I said before, the Northern Sea Route is seeing less traffic than it's seen in 15 years. And so while the Arctic will remain central to Russian thinking, whether they can capitalize on it in the ways that the Kremlin may envision, I think remains a question worthy of debate. Over.
No, thank you. I see that as well. Doug, you want to add to that?
Just to add, I think, yes, what's happening in Ukraine is going to drain capabilities away from the Arctic, but the drivers that were driving Russian interests in the Arctic before February 24 are still in play. I think beforehand, the figure was, I think 20 to 25% of Russia's GDP was coming from the Arctic. That figure may be different now, but the economic, imperative for Russia is still there. It still sees the Northern Sea Route as an important future commercial trade route. And so, we've seen this play out even after February 24. We've seen Russia, it was in August that they announced this $300 million plan to build out and develop the Northern Sea Route. We saw a major naval exercise in August up in the Arctic. So they may have they may have to militarily shift more capability to Ukraine, but the long-term drivers that remain, and Russia will continue to see the Arctic as key to its economic future and to its security.
Yeah, I know. I agree with that. I agree with that completely. And I think our report, even though it was written a few months ago, echoes that as well. Let me return to the audience. I've got a question from Nesreen, and she says, what are the key geopolitical and security interests of circumpolar states in the Arctic? And how will these evolve as the climate changes? So we're now broadening our look a bit. It's just the geopolitical and security interests of circumpolar states. Doug, it sounds like a question for you.
Well, I think as we look at some of the changes that are happening in the Arctic, it concerns more states. I mean, I think while it's important that Arctic states remain in control of what happens in the Arctic, it is an area where we have governance. Climate change is impacting the globe. It's impacting the Arctic disproportionately, and those changes affect countries all over. The opening of new trade routes has broader effects beyond just the Arctic nations, and also the access to new minerals and other resources that could unlock economic competition. There are countries beyond the Arctic nations interested there as well. So I think a lot of the dynamics you see playing out in the Arctic are having an impact widely beyond the Arctic, and it's impacting the interests of other countries who are going to become increasingly interested in will try to become more involved in the Arctic going forward.
That's right. No, I agree with that. We tend to focus on Russia, China, US, and then a little bit of NATO, but there's a lot of other nations that are very much involved as well. And and keeping that open mind is going to be important. Greg, you want to add anything to that, or would you like to go back to the audience? We've got 5 minutes left, and then you guys can go back to work. So, so Greg, you want to add anything about the circumpolar nations?
Yeah, I'll just say really briefly that the Arctic is like anywhere else, and the countries that reside there, have a range of political, economic, and security interests and concerns as relates to the Arctic. But I do want to sort of emphasize what Doug mentioned about the sort of double-edged sword that is climate change. Operating in the Arctic, maintaining installations and facilities in the Arctic is in many ways becoming more challenging due to the effects of climate change and coastal erosion and permafrost, reductions in permafrost. And yet at the same time, the region is becoming more accessible. And so a number of the Arctic nations, have the potential to capitalize on some of the natural resources and other economic opportunities that are sort of more accessible, warmer Arctic presents. And as we've noted, there are real differences in the North American Arctic vis-a-vis the European Arctic, and the effects that ocean currents have on just how warm the European Arctic is vis-a-vis the, say, American Arctic in Alaska. So I think we're going to see this play out in different ways for different countries. But the one thing I think that is worth bearing in mind is, it's Russia who ultimately has the greatest percentage of the Arctic population. It has the greatest number of sort of installations and facilities in the Arctic, and it's going to face real challenges in terms of maintaining those facilities in the face of the threats of climate change. So, that's going to be a sort of cost center for Russia rather than a profit center, at least in the near term.
That's a very, very good point. And for us too, I think the service budgets, handling Thule Air Force Base in Greenland, or the sites in Alaska, the budgets are going to have to go up to figure out how to keep the permafrost at a stage that you can maintain a foundation. So yes, thank you very much for that reminder. We've got time for one more question. And let me go and see who that will be. We spin the dial here. Let's go with David. This is a lightning round, and says it's for Greg. How would you characterize the amount of attention your new office can give to Arctic security concerns as a regional issue rather than joint force resilience as a functional issue? Well, that's an interesting question. It sounds like you know something about OSD. Let me read it to you one more time for Greg. How would you characterize the amount of attention your new office can give to Arctic security concerns as a regional issue rather than joint force resilience as a functional issue?
Yeah, so recognizing this is the lightning round, I'll try to be brief. So needless to say, our focus needs to be on both of the aspects of David's question. We need to be thinking very purposefully about the ways in which we make our joint force more resilient, enhance its ability to operate wherever it needs to, no matter the weather, the challenges of climate, or other circumstances. So that's something that the whole department is engaged in, obviously from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the combatant commands and the military department. So all the way through, we're incorporating thinking about these challenges at every level of decision making. That said, as you well know, Jim, the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy has this strong kind of international bearing. And, a big part of what we do is that interface with allies and partners around shared defense challenges and working through the ways in which we can develop capabilities that are mutually complementary and interoperable. So I think the short answer to David's question is we need to do both. We are still admittedly a small team, and we're trying to do a great deal, but we have a lot of capability across the department. And the fact that our strategic documents really underscore from the secretary on down the criticality of these issues, I think is going to help us drive progress on both aspects of David's question.
Well, that's a very good answer. You're an OSD pro, OSD policy pro. I can see that. Doug, do you have any final words? And then we'll let you go back to work.
Thanks, Jim. No final words other than, I'm sure Greg's going to do a great job on balancing all aspects of the job. Now, just to thank you, Jim, for this. It's an incredibly timely report. and I think is contributing a lot to this dialogue. So thank you for the report and for this event.
Well, thank you, and thank both of you for taking your time out of what I know is very, very difficult to do, to break off from the inbox and to do this. I appreciate that. It's great outreach by the administration. Appreciate that as well. We wish you both the best as you get into the Arctic work, and we stand by to help out in any way we can. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and to all of your colleagues who contributed to what I think is a really terrific report, and I commend it to everyone who's watching online today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. In fact, we're going to hear from some right now. So thank you. So we're now at the point where I'm going to extinguish the Fireside chat, the fireplace behind me now. I'm going to turn that off, and we're going to go instead to a great round with three absolute experts when it comes to the Arctic. And I'm so pleased they were able to appear with us today. Two of the three, in fact, wrote papers that helped inform how we put together this report. And they're here to tell us if we got it right or not. And so I'd like to welcome the following three. Ambassador Carla Sands, I think you all will appear on the screen, as well as Katarzyna Zisk, who is coming to us from overseas, and then Rebecca Pincus, who is here as well. I'm going to tell you a little bit about these three, and thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed our little fireside chat. I do wish I had a fireside. I just think it kind of should go with the title. But Ambassador Carla Sands, she was the U.S. ambassador to Denmark, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands in the last administration. I'm so glad that to see the addition of Greenland and Faroe Islands to the title. Those are very important pieces of geography that I think you're going to tell us all about during this time. Katarzyna Zisk is a professor of international relations and contemporary history at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. She was an author of one of the papers, and I can tell you her institute has been very involved in Arctic and the high north issues. The Norwegian voice at NATO is very important to bring before the alliance the high north issues. Sometimes I think Norway felt they were all alone in talking about it, although Iceland certainly shares that. But you've got two new allies joining you, Sweden and Finland. So I predict the high north voice is going to become much louder in the alliance meetings. And then finally, Rebecca Pincus, who is a well-known name and well-known expert, director of the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center. I'm an adjunct senior fellow at the Wilson Center as well. I've enjoyed my relationship there, and you've taught me everything I know about the Arctic. So welcome to you as well, Rebecca. Why don't we, what I want to do is have each of the three panelists start off with just some quick comments based on what you just heard in the fireside chat, or after you've read what we wrote. You want to correct the record, that would be great too. But we're going to start with Ambassador Sands, who's got something to say about her experience as the ambassador to U.S. ambassador to Denmark, and particularly what she saw when she dealt with Greenland and particularly the Faroe Islands. So Ambassador Sands, welcome. And why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Jim, and hello to everyone that's joining. So I was recently the ambassador to Denmark, and part of the kingdom is Greenland and the Faroe Islands. And when I was getting ready to go, I learned about the aggression, both economic and military aggression, by China and by Russia in the region. And so I made a goal. My number one goal when I was going through ambassador school was to open a consulate in Greenland. We hadn't had a diplomatic presence for 67 years. And when I went around to the White House, DOD, and the State Department, really there was no interest in increasing our presence in the high north. And I got a lot of no's. But I was at the National Science Foundation for a briefing when I saw a map of the Arctic on the wall. And I'm going to ask our presenters to put the map up for you so you can see it. So this map of the Arctic, the point of view is the actual North Pole. This is how the People's Republic military, so the Chinese military, looks at the Arctic, as does their their country leadership. And you can see that from about 10 o'clock until about 3 or 4 o'clock is the Russian coast. That Russian coast is unlike any other coast in the Arctic. It's heavily militarized. They've reopened old Cold War bases. They've created new points of militarization. They have 40 icebreakers. Some have missiles. So this is the Russian coast. Now, if you drop down, the Russian border is with Finland around 3, 4 o'clock. Go to around 10 o'clock and 9 o'clock. That's the American state of Alaska. Then as you continue counterclockwise, that's Canada. And then dead at 6 o'clock, that giant landmass is the island of Greenland. It's 1/3 the size of the continental United States with about 55,000 inhabitants. And then off to the right there, a little speck is in the GI-UK gap are the Faroe Islands. So this is how I looked at the region, and our team did as well. And so I took that map, and I also took a book that I found while I was in Greenland. Can we show that book? It's just a book about the US military occupation of Greenland during World War II. And I went, thank you so much. I went to every, about half of our departments, took the map in the book to secretaries, assistant secretaries, deputy assistant secretaries, PDAS, and shared the concern I had about the region and how we were absent, and that vacuum that we were creating was being filled by China and Russia in different ways. And we actually were successful, and we can show the folks now our new consulate. We opened in June of 2020. This is the actual building today. It's a temporary building, but we're there. And so we have that presence to increase our cooperation. Thanks so much for showing those slides. So what we were able to do was reopen our consulate to create this diplomatic presence. We were able to work to get a Coast Guard billet based in Denmark for Arctic security and achieve trade and cooperation agreements with both the Faroe Islands and with Greenland to increase resilience against malign interests from say Russia or China. And we were also able to renegotiate something called the Thule Air Base Maintenance Contract. We have an air base at the north of Greenland. It's our most northern base that the US has. And we had a dispute for about 5 years when I got there, and it was causing problems between the US and our ally, Denmark, but also Greenland. So we were able to renegotiate that to the satisfaction of the Danes and the Greenlanders, further strengthening our resilience in the region. So I encourage you to look at the Arctic as a whole as we talk about this, because we really do see Russia is a presence unlike any other, and we have to always keep that in mind. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for bringing those pictures. I'll have to say, you might not know this, but when I was the young Nordic desk officer, 1990, 1991, 1992, I helped lead the team to dismantle a lot of what we had up in Greenland for the Cold War. Radar sites along the south, the die sites, Kulusuk, Sonnerstrom Fjord, 2 bases we had there, and we left Thule up there, thank goodness. And so I'll have to say, those days are long behind us, and I'm really happy to see a U.S. footprint back there in Greenland and Faroe Islands too. I could talk a long time about that infrastructure up there. So I was really glad to see that, and I agree with you in terms of the need to make sure there's not a gap that's filled by others. But let's turn to Katarzyna Zisk. You know, coming out of Norway, as I mentioned, Norway has, while the U.S. might have dismantled in Greenland, and also we closed our base in Iceland, we closed some navigational facilities on the Faroe Islands. We stopped a lot of our work with Norway, frankly, and on anti-submarine warfare, things like that. While the U.S. and the West might have pulled in from a lot of what we did during the Cold War in the Arctic and in the high north, Norway did not. Norway continued the P3 flights. Norway has always had a correct relationship with Russia, and has had to deal with continue to deal with the Northern Fleet area while almost alone as the rest of the nations of NATO took a peace dividend and wasn't up there as much as we used to be. So, Katarzyna, tell us more about what you're seeing out of Norway and what you think might be happening in the coming year or so in that Northern Fleet area as Russia has to deal not just with Ukraine, but the fact that Sweden and Finland will be joining NATO.
Right. Thank you very much, Jim, and thanks to CNAS, the whole team, Andrea in particular, for bringing attention to this important aspects of the implications, the impact of the war, which has also spillover effects, it's been said already in the Arctic as well. And you're right, indeed, Norway has maintained its attention in different ways, including in an expertise. Russia's studies has never been defunded compared to many other countries. So this is something we are continuing, and I also have been doing a lot of work over the past 15 years on the Arctic, including Russia in the Arctic. And I would like to highlight, maybe to start the discussion, two important aspects of the Russian approach in the Arctic. And first is the fact that, well, you have touched upon this in the previous panel, namely the question whether Russia's extensive material and personal losses in Ukraine, including hundreds of soldiers that were lost from the Arctic units, including the 200 motorized brigade, the Arctic Brigade from Pechenga, whether that would weaken Russia's military footprint in the Arctic, including in the European part of the Arctic, and whether Russia would deprioritize the region, especially as the economic situation continues to worsen and is likely to get even worse in the times ahead. So, and also because the region, as it's also been mentioned, still remains one of the most stable regions, most stable Russian borderlands. And I think this is a logical question, but however, Russia does not apply this logic, it seems. To date, there are no indications, in fact, that Russia will deprioritize the Arctic. It seems to stand strong in Moscow, as recently corroborated both at the doctrinal policy level and at the implementation level. For instance, the Russian maritime doctrine that was updated in July moved the Arctic to the top of the list of regional priorities. We also see that the Russian military activity, surprisingly, given what's happening in Ukraine, is still quite intense in the region. In August, for instance, Russia conducted a large military exercise, which involved 10 surface vessels, the flagship of the Northern Fleet, Piotr Wielki. There were air and coastal defenses involved. So it seems that this is so important to Russia, this region, for a number of reasons we can discuss, that despite what this disaster, military and political and economic disaster, Russia still has an attention turned toward the Arctic. And the second point I would like to make is that the Russian coercive diplomacy and the use of force we have observed in the Russian policies over basically since 2008 in particular, has harmed Russia's economic and political ambitions in the Arctic. For instance, by limiting Russia's ability to expand its energy exploration offshore. In particular, Russia needs Western investments, Western technology, Western know-how, and they don't get that, especially since 2014, and it will get worse. So it has also undermined the Russian ambition to turn the Northern Sea Route into a major international transit route. This has been one of these great sort of poster projects for Russia in the Arctic. And one Russian entrepreneur aptly put it, the feeling among international shippers and traders right now is that everything that goes through Russia turns into acid, into poison. And finally, I would like to also add that the Russian ambition to solidify its position as the leading Arctic nation, this has been one of these major goals since 2000, expressed like this since 2008, has also been undermined by the Russian policies. It stands in contrast with the fact that Russia's current status is basically a pariah in various Arctic cooperation forums at the bilateral level, at the sub-regional and regional level, including the suspended cooperation in the Barents Euro-Arctic cooperation and in the Arctic Council. So while Russian military activity is still stands strong, and especially the focus is in particular on the European Arctic, it seems Russia will likely emphasize the role of nuclear weapons to compensate for the growing asymmetry, capability gap in the conventional realm, especially compared to the United States and NATO. But the economic development will likely to be continue to be undermined by the direct and indirect consequences of Russia's policies, foreign policy. Thank you.
Well, that's quite a lot to talk about, and I think a lot of what you said, it tracks with our findings as well in the report. So let me turn to Rebecca. I think we've heard quite a bit now, both from the ambassador and from Katarzyna, about Russia and what we're seeing up there. What's your take on it? What remarks would you want to make about both our report, your own work, as well as what we just heard?
Thanks, Jim. Great event so far, and one of the benefits about batting cleanup for such an outstanding panel is that I'm going to agree with everything that's come before me, and I'll try to keep my remarks short so we can move to questions. I think that the report flags some really important drivers that I'm certainly watching. And one of those is decisions on the part of Chinese leadership about the extent to which they are interested in stepping into the funding gap that Katarzyna just mentioned. The extent to which the China-Russia partnership will evolve in coming months and years, I think, is critically important, and your report really underlines that. I think it's tremendously important. The future course of Russian leadership, I think we're all watching news out of Russia these days, not knowing what the future will hold. It's very unclear. This has been a remarkable 6 months and 7 months, and I think we still, as yet, have very little handle on what Russian politics will look like in months and years, and I think it'll be tremendously important. So anyone who tells you they know what the future holds for Russia in the Arctic, I have questions.
I agree.
And the last piece that I think I'll put in there, again, a couple quick thoughts here. The Arctic remains a really, really challenging region to operate in. And I think that's something we need to bear in mind. So whatever else is going on in the military and the economic domains, it is still operationally very challenging. And there are real questions about Northern Sea Route development on the operational basis. It's hard to navigate there. A major flotilla of ships got trapped in sea ice there last November for a couple of weeks. It's dark, it's cold, there's a lack of infrastructure. Economic trends are also making it really challenging for Russia to develop the NSR in addition to sanctions. And so I think we are at a point now where there's certainly a lot of interest in resources, but there's an enormous amount of flux happening. So I think we're fortunate in many ways to, as Greg Pollock mentioned at the top, right now the Arctic is free from conflict, and that is, we're very lucky for that because we have a lot of challenges to manage around the globe. And so I think we have some breathing space to carefully consider policy, diplomacy, and security in the Arctic while so much is in flux, and kind of focusing on the core elements. What are the core threat assessments up there? What are the key drivers? Sketching out those potential scenarios. I think the report does a really helpful job of surfacing those really important elements that will help us steer through a very uncertain future. And congratulations. It's a terrific report. Thanks. I was happy to be a part of it.
Well, thank you for being a part of it. Your papers were very important. So let me ask the three of you a question, and then we're going to move to the audience. You heard from Doug that they're going to update the 2013 strategy. So there's a lot of work in the interagency on that, as well as the defense, updating the defense strategy on the Arctic. This is your opportunity to give one piece of advice to the administration as they are doing their work. And Rebecca, a lot of what you just said sounded a bit like some advice. So let me actually start with Ambassador Sands, if you were still in the government and in the interagency, and you knew that the NSC staff were honchoing this update to 2013 document, what is the one thing that you feel they really need to have in that strategy that is probably not there now? So what is it? Is it the Faroe Islands you want to point to? What is your advice to them?
Well, I think it is not siloing, and so that the interagency pulls together, but also that there's dialogue also with NATO, with EUCOM, with NORTHCOM, that all of the players, and you just don't get that. You reach out here and there, but to pull everyone together to strengthen our cooperation internally so that we can be more successful externally, because this is a really big challenge. It's something that maybe we were asleep at the switch for a long time through perhaps decades. And so now we're reaping the consequences, but also making sure that it stays a low tension zone or area region when you have so much militarization. And then you have China's 2018 white paper that they wrote, the Polar Silk Road, where they have absolute intention of being involved in governance and benefiting economically from the Arctic, and even saying they're entitled because they have 25% of the population of the world. They should have 25% of the Arctic. So we have to be very careful that the lines remain clear and that we are united, I would say, NATO allies in the Arctic to deter those who don't have our best interests at heart.
Very good advice. I like the not the stovepipe. I think that's excellent. And that's a problem always in writing these strategies. Katarzyna, let me ask you. You, of course, work in Norway. You're part of the institute there, but I'm going to put you into the interagency for a few minutes, and you get to sit around the table at the NSC and contribute to the discussions there. What's your one piece of advice that you need to that you want this administration to come away with for their strategy?
I think what is, with the observation over the past 15 years, we have had the discussion, what Arctic issues belong to the sort of global Arctic, globally, fully, like regionally, should be treated from the global perspective, such as climate change. You cannot tackle it just in the Arctic region. There are some regional issues, and then there are sub-regional, even local issues. And I think understanding what belongs where is very important, because Arctic is a quite diverse region of many important, but also varying sub-regions. So, sorting out these issues correctly will be important. And at the sub-regional level, especially if looking from my European perspective, I think it is also important to understand that there is these regions, so the high north, the Baltic, the Black Sea region are much more connected. They're interconnected security spaces, and they should be treated like that. And right. I think the Finland and Sweden joining NATO will even reinforce that aspect, because these are Arctic countries, but they have a strong footprint, of course, in the Baltic Sea. Yeah,
I agree with that completely, and I hope that they have that perspective as they write this update. Well, Rebecca, it's now up to you. What's your piece of advice? I heard you say some things that sounded pretty good, but you're in the interagency now. You're sitting there in the OAOB, and NSC's running this meeting. What's your advice?
Great thought exercise. I think a lot about putting the Arctic in a global context, and I think, when we think about these big overarching documents like the National Security Strategy or the National Defense Strategy, we have to look around the world at the threat picture and the opportunity picture for the United States, and then kind of fit the Arctic in there. And so I think a lot about efficiencies, because what we know is that we're focused on China as the pacing challenge. And right now we have a second priority of, land war in Europe that we haven't seen in decades. That is very costly, and it's going to remain very costly into the future. Not only, the war effort, but the refugee effort, rebuilding Ukraine. And so we have a focus on the Indo-Pacific theater as the top priority, peer competition with China, which is a global competition involving all elements of US power. We have, land war in Europe, which is we're sending a lot of support, a lot of arms, a lot of money, and that will continue in the future. That means that there is not there's not sort of resources and time and attention lying around looking for a use. We're in a strapped position from a sort of policy attention and a financial perspective, and so thinking about ways of advancing our work in the Arctic, it's got to be done with efficiency in mind. How can we sort of maximize effectiveness, as the ambassador said, work with our allies and partners, break down those stovepipes that create inefficiency. But the idea that we should that there's sort of a lot of time and resources to throw into the Arctic, it's not true. We're strapped right now. So we have to have greater effects with probably, about the same amount of resources, I would think. And so that brings me to focusing on, find efficiencies. Don't go to the simple answer of, more. It's sort of more effect.
Boy, that's great advice. And it reminds me, I probably should have asked Greg earlier on his new office there in OSD policy. I'm sure that the people who do China and the Indo-Pacific and some of the other regions had the knives out saying, don't think you're going to come in with your Arctic office and take over. And so I'm sure that they're having to defend themselves bureaucratically all the time. But you're right. We are strapped. We're very thin. There's fights between the guys who do Europe and the folks who do Indo-Pacific over where U.S. forces should go. And now you throw the Arctic into this too. So it's tough. And so very, very good advice there. So we're going to go to the audience right now. There's a good question that has come in from, if I can find it now, from Breton, if I got your name right. And this is for Katarzyna. And the question is, broadly, what new lines of cooperation do you think Norway intends to pursue on the Arctic in the NATO context, now that Finland and Sweden are joining the alliance? How will Norway's cooperation evolve with Sweden and Finland in the alliance? That's a great question. I'm wondering that myself. So this is about Norway. What are you going to pursue in the Arctic in the NATO context? And then also Sweden and Finland joining. How will that impact cooperation? That's with Norway, and also the cooperation within the alliance among the Nordic nations. So what do you think?
Well, I think it's a great opportunity, because that was something that, even though there has been the cooperation within between the Nordic countries, the defense cooperation has been developing over the years. The problem always was the lack of Article 5, the formal solidarity commitment in case of a crisis of conflict. This is now gone, and I think this opens a number of possibilities, including cooperation on air defense in the region, logistics and supply, use of military bases in these various countries, joint exercises and training. I think intelligence exchange and situational awareness with regard to the Arctic will also be greatly enhanced by the fact. I think so that's sort of defense cooperation, but also it opens new possibilities for these countries to work on social resilience, social security, and all the addressing activities below the threshold. So I think in general, we are having this gap, security defense gap in the region closing up, and that will greatly strengthen, in my view, security of Norway and of the whole region.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think you laid it out really well, and I'm really looking forward over time to watch. I've worked with the Nordics for many years, and I'm looking forward to watching the dynamics with Sweden and Finland coming in. It's going to be, I'll be eating popcorn. That'll be that icon for me watching this happen. So it's going to be very interesting. So thank you for that. Some very good questions coming in from the audience. One is for Ambassador Sands, and I think this is a good question. It's from Adam. Ambassador Sands, is there a common understanding of how we differentiate between a malign Chinese interest on the one hand and investment from legitimate economic investments in the other? And I think that, I think Greenland had to wrestle with that. Are there some Chinese interests and investments that are legitimate and might make sense for a nation? or are there not? Or we have to consider all Chinese interests as being malign? So, is there as the ambassador, how would you advise Greenland, say, to make that kind of decision about interest from China?
Well, thanks for the question. Here's the thing: if it's a Chinese state-owned enterprise, it is a malign investment. They are working actively to make investments, to make loans, do projects that ultimately many countries can't service the debt, and the Chinese take the asset or something in exchange. We can look at Djibouti, we can look at Sri Lanka, Montenegro. There are so many examples around the world. If, for instance, one of the Chinese state-owned enterprises tried to build 3 airports in Greenland. Greenland has basically no infrastructure. There's not even a road between any of the towns. Nothing is connected except by air or by sea, if the sea is passable, if it's open. So they tried to finance and build 3 airports. Well, thankfully, the Danish government stepped in and said, you know what, we'll finance those airports and we'll get this done. And China withdrew from bidding on the construction, because if it's the Chinese state-owned enterprise, this is China's way of gaining power in the world. And it's just another pearl in their necklace of control of trade routes. And with the trade routes comes military support. And so we have a global, it's not just about the Arctic, it's the entire globe, the US. We really can't take our eyes away from any region, because we have the ascendant China, and we have to counter them everywhere. I'll just give you the example of Antarctica. I mean, we're talking about the Arctic, but I mean, every region, and we do have constrained resources, as Rebecca mentioned. And so it's a challenge, but we still have to deter our greatest adversary, who is working every day by every means available. Economic is one of them. 80 million people every day wake up in China and work to defeat the United States.
Did you have an example with Antarctica? You mentioned that there was an example.
I'm just saying there's a big Chinese presence there. And when China says, well, we're going to do research, it's not just research. It comes with other activities. And I'm sure you ladies can talk about that. I mean, the military is there, and they attempt to attain supremacy. They want to be the global hegemon, and we'll all be vassal states. And we have to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Well, Katarzyna and Rebecca, the ambassador suggested that you all would probably have a view on that too. Katarzyna, do you have a view on China and the investments that they make, whether it's state-owned or however it might be? Katarzyna.
Yes, of course. I fully agree. This is in general, very problematic, given the fact that the differences in values, in the fact how China has actually been using that to its own advantage. The political pressure we've seen exercising by China in other countries where they've made all these investments. I think concern is that, well, to date, China has been actually behaving very responsibly in the Arctic, has not been trying to challenge. The problem is, of course, we see what China does in other regions. It is really hard to ignore it. And the fact that my concern is, as China continues to make the investments, for now, in particular in the Russian Arctic, that this at some point may be followed also by growing political ambitions, maybe also some security or even military presence to provide safety for these different operations of China in the region. And that may, of course, lead to frictions and increased tension in the region, because, of course, the Arctic is just one of the platforms where we also see the US-Chinese rivalry growing. So that I would add this to the discussion.
If I could just speak to that for 1 second.
Sure.
So I will just say I disagree with you, because in the Faroe Islands, Huawei wanted to be the 5G provider. And I wrote an op-ed cautioning the Faroe Islands, the people of the Faroe Islands leadership, not a good idea, because it doesn't have a back door, it has a front door. And it's, you know, it's not a good carrier to use because it's a state-owned enterprise, more or less, and a way of spying and controlling. And the Chinese ambassador went and threatened the premier. You're not going to get a trade deal if you don't use Huawei in your 5G. And it plugs into Scotland. So it's a part of that GI-UK area. And, you know, that threat is absolutely how China plays. They own a minority interest in a majority of the mines, even in Greenland. So there is absolutely not always good citizen behavior from China in the Arctic.
So may I don't think we disagree. I was exactly what I was trying to say. So maybe I have expressed myself not very clearly. No. Yes, I do agree.
I think Katarzyna was saying that in the past,
oh, okay.
China but as we see their actions across the world, you can't assume that they're not doing the same thing in the Arctic. And I think your example is an important and a good one. I'm glad you did that op-ed. I'm sure that was the first time an op-ed had been put into the Faroese Gazette. Let me ask Rebecca, you want to add anything to that, and then we're going to go back to the audience.
You know, excellent points all around. I think, you know, we're fortunate in the Arctic region to be working with a strong network of, you know, very strong, capable democratic allies, as Greg noted earlier, Greg Pollock, and also Des Jones noted that. And I think in the last few years, we've seen a tremendous amount of attention paid to the sort of potential strings attached to Chinese investment. And I think scrutiny of those investments has increased significantly. And so in the last couple of years, we've really seen some potentially problematic investments blocked. And so I think the level of awareness is much greater. And, you know, I think in many ways that's a success story that we can be very happy about. I think really right now the question when it comes to Chinese investment in the Arctic is really focused on Russia. And that's something where we obviously have very little leverage and, you know, need to be very careful about the ways in which Chinese investment in Russia would increase Chinese leverage over the Russian Arctic in ways that are adverse to the United States interest. You know, following the 2015 round of sanctions, we saw a pretty deliberate turn on the part of Russia towards Chinese capital. And that's, I think I would argue that's bad for the United States. So obviously that's something that the second order effects we need to be very attentive to. So far, we've seen that the major Chinese enterprises have been largely complying with sanctions. They're avoiding those secondary sanctions, but that's a major leverage point. And I think it's going to be very interesting to watch the extent to which Chinese investment continues to flow into the Russian Arctic or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely right. So we're going to have two more questions. We're just about at the bewitching time. And the first one is going to come from our friends in the audience. And I have to find it again. There it is, from Brendan. And this is also a question that would have been good for the Fireside chat. And that was, do we see an expansion of U.S. military presence in the Arctic, either with new facilities or basing agreements with Arctic allies? Very interesting. Do we see an expansion of U.S. military presence in the Arctic, either with new facilities or basing agreements with Arctic allies? And I think what I want to start is with Katarzyna, because, you know, Norway, we've got a lot of U.S. military now going back and forth through Norway, particularly the Marines. And so with the Navy, with P-8s, you know, working with yours, F-35s, the Air Force. I mean, there's a lot that can happen up in Norway. So how would you answer that question?
I would say briefly yes, and it also depends what kind of period of time we are talking about, because that presence has been increasing gradually. You know, I mean, it's also in the context of NATO cooperation. We've seen, you know, the military exercises have been larger. Trajan juncture was, I think, 50,000 soldiers. We see, for instance, US has periodically deployed strategic capabilities such as aircraft carriers, for instance, during the NATO Trident Juncture exercise, which was operating close to the Arctic Circle for the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union. It was in 2018. And yes, the presence of the US Marines has been increasing. There have been different arrangements, but in general, there is a stronger footprint. Also, the surface naval presence, the submarines, US submarines and Air Force have continued patrols in the Arctic over the years. But again, we've seen more surface naval presence in the region. As you mentioned also, the US has been using the facilities, allied facilities existing already in the region. And I think it's a great idea. It saves money, but also in a way, it's not unnecessarily, expanding. Maybe we will have expansion of infrastructure, but to date it has not been necessary. And I think it's a great idea. For instance, the US bombers, Lancers, they have been landing on Norwegian air bases. So in general, we see that both NATO and the US footprint in the region is stronger, and this is a response to Russia's policies in the region in general, but also on the broader international stage. So we also had, of course, the reestablishment of the Second Fleet and the US-based Atlantic Command in Norfolk. So I'm talking basically about the last, let's say, 5 years. We've seen that definitely growing up.
Yep, no, absolutely. In fact, when I left the Pentagon in 2017, the last thing I did was to go through Iceland and Norway and to exactly talk about and get those things going. But Rebecca, you, and then off to the ambassador. Rebecca, what do you think?
I'll make it really quick. We can't forget about Alaska.
I was going to say, yeah.
Alaska hosts the largest concentration of F-35s in the world, and we now have a reactivated 11th Airborne Division. So the U.S. Army has a massive presence in Alaska as well. Enormous U.S. Coast Guard presence, and Navy is becoming more and more active and has some installations in Alaska. And so we cannot forget that we have, a very formidable outpost in the United States Arctic. We also work incredibly closely with our Canadian allies through NORAD Northcom. We're all focused on NORAD modernizations, which will be improving the over-horizon radar capabilities. And so I think we can't forget about the North American Arctic. It is in the process of getting some really formidable and modern capabilities.
Absolutely right.
That's why we both are here, Becca.
Yeah.
Both are on the panel.
Absolutely. Ambassador.
Yeah, really briefly. I think that we are seeing that we at U.S. military needs to be more nimble, that the threats pop up here and there. And we saw such a big footprint in the Middle East, and we got so mired in that region for so long. And we can see that, we have to have a more global perspective, I think. And as we redistribute resources, I do agree it's so much more efficient to be able to go where we're needed. And the Alaska cooperation in the Arctic with the native populations and bringing up, I would say, capabilities also makes these both Canada and Denmark more resilient to malign influence. I mean, when the PRC flew the Greenlandic premier and their government over, rolled out the red carpet, 30 C-suite guys offering, what can we do? I mean, that's how this happens. And so I think nimble and a light footprint, like Katerina was talking about, is excellent.
So we have one question left. It's a very good one. It's a quick one for a lightning round. This is going to be a one-word answer. And the question is, if I can find it again, it's from David, rolling back in. The question is, what Arctic scenario keeps the panelist up at night? So give me one Arctic scenario. If you use one word, that would be even better. What keeps you up at night? Rebecca.
A nuclear accident. Russia has sunken nuclear reactors in the Kara Sea that are rusting rapidly. Terrifying.
Katarzyna.
Two. We give two. Escalation. So basically, Russian, what Russia has exercised over the past more than a decade, scenarios when a local confrontation basically reaches the regional level involving NATO and the United States. And that's where the Arctic, of course, the bastion defense in the region would be rolled out. Another one, search and rescue, disaster relief, and human assistance in the Arctic, all kinds of scenarios, including oil spill, cruise ship going aground, and that also would be probably quite disastrous in the region.
Ambassador.
So 2, like Katerina, number 1 would be an escalation where there's an accident and it's provocative and then it escalates, which would be terrible. But to your point about the cruise ship, when we saw Trident Juncture, we had real ships that couldn't actually operate, and things happened. It was hard to get the seamen off the vessel. If that actually, you know what? I think it was actually a cruise ship off the coast of Norway, and it was hard to get the people off. It wasn't Trident Juncture. It was a private cruise. If it was so hard to get people off this cruise ship just off the coast of a rich Norwegian coast, what's going to happen if we have a cruise ship disaster that's exploring one of these, remote areas where there are no resources and there is really no capable search and rescue? So I agree with you 100%.
Thank you all so much. We are out of time. Those scenarios keep me up at night as well. Let's hope that we can resolve some of those so we can get a good night's sleep. But to the panelists, thank you so much for taking time out of your personal schedules. And I'm so impressed with everyone. Just the knowledge coming out heartens me. So thank you all so much. And I hope our paths will cross again. And I'd like to thank all of our audience as well, and the great questions that came our way. Just excellent. I think 10 years ago, we would not have seen this kind of interest in these kinds of questions and this expertise, but we're seeing it now, and we will see it in the future, and you all will be the leaders of that. So thank you so much. Please, everyone, check into the CNAS website, look for the Russia in the Arctic piece, and send us your cards and letters with any comments you may have. So thank you all so much, and have a good afternoon.